Hello, my name is Gene Monterastelli, and I am the editor of TappingQA.com. And the video that you are about to watch is an interview that I did as part of the 24 Hours of Tapping. The 24 Hours of Tapping was a free event, which was a fundraiser for the Peaceful Heart Network. The Peaceful Heart Network provides training and trauma relief tools to those in war-torn countries, as well as working with refugees all over the world. They've been able to help out over 200,000 people all over the world. After you watch this video, if you find this video something that was useful, the very easy way that you can say thank you to the guest for giving their time and sharing their expertise is to go to 24hoursoftapping.com/support and make a small contribution to support the Peaceful Heart Network. Again, that is 24hoursoftapping.com/support, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Our next presentation is from someone who I'm very, very lucky to have become a friend with over the course of the last couple of years. One day, just out of the blue, I received an awesome email from David asking me a question about something I had written, which kind of blew my mind. For those of you who do not know, David Feinstein is a clinical psychologist who has received 9 national awards for his books on consciousness and healing. He has served as faculty at Antioch College and Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, which is where he studied as well. He and his wife, Donna Eden, have built one of the largest and most vibrant organizations teaching energy medicine. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with Eden Energy. David actually originally agreed to be with us, and then he sheepishly sent me an email saying, we have been invited, him and Donna, to go to Estonia and lead a bunch of training. So at this moment, David is in Estonia leading a training, but what he did do is he found some time ahead of time to have a conversation with me. And so basically what we did is we explored his journey from going from someone who is skeptical to someone who is doing it and the lessons that he learned along the way. And so here is my conversation with David Feinstein about the lessons that he has learned from research along the way. So one of the things that I appreciate about you and all the work that you do is you provide all of these really amazing resources, summarizing things, doing research, which is great and useful for me because that means I don't have to do it and I have a place to point to really good resources, which makes life a lot easier. But the second is, I imagine that as you have been going through all of this, that hopefully you've not just been affirming the things that you've already known, but you've actually been learning things along the way. So as you kind of over the course of your careers, you spent time in energy psychology and diving in, what are some of the things that have surprised you in this particular process as you've been engaging in all of this?
That's a great question, Gene. It's been surprise after surprise after surprise. The first time I heard of energy psychology, of EFT, was in around 1998.
Mm-hmm.
And I was leading a supervision group for other therapists in Ashland, Oregon. And one of the participants in the group had taken a workshop in EFT and came back to the group and was really excited about it and was talking about these points that she was working with and how it changed things really fast and overcame phobias and all that. And she showed how it looks. And I thought, that is really ridiculous. I mean, That is over the top. And I won't say I made fun of her, but I certainly didn't respond in a very welcoming way.
Right.
And it, and you kind of judge people, and then it comes back to bite you, so that now I'm, getting that response from the whole academic psychology community.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first surprise, was that anybody could think that something that looks that ridiculous actually works. When I was a psychologist who talked to people and did imagery and worked with their dreams and did really deep work. And so this tapping while saying an absurd phrase, just didn't make sense. So then Donna Eden, my wife, and I went on the road in right around 2000, because her book came out and we were doing energy medicine workshops. So people started asking me about energy psychology, and I didn't know anything about it really. And when you're in that position, you have two basic choices. You can admit it that you don't know, or you can fake it. And about that time, I was invited to a demonstration. I was in a city that had a psychology group that met in one of the psychologists' homes each, I think each quarter or each month. And that particular evening, one of the psychologists who had studied thought field therapy was going to introduce it to the group. And the way they set it up was that another group member brought a patient in that he was having trouble with. And this woman had a fear of enclosed spaces, or a long-term claustrophobia that he was going to treat. And so there was maybe a dozen people, and it was in the living room, and the therapist, the thought field therapist, or the newly minted thought field therapist, he was very new at this, and this woman get in the center, and he starts talking to her as all of the rest of us are around in our chairs. And I was comfortable with the first few interchanges. He asked a little bit about the history and what her symptoms were. And so this is all going fine, and I'm making sense of it. And then he asks her to do a SUD rating and on her fear of being in an elevator. And so she does that, and I'm familiar with SUD rating because I've done systematic desensitization, and Wolpe's rating system is used all over the place, the 0 to 10. So she gives that rating, and then, however, he has her rub these spots on her chest and say things like, even though I'm afraid of elevators, I deeply love and accept myself. Now, that seemed really cheap. I mean, I've done hypnosis. I'm a hypnotist, and you don't just kind of reinforce the symptom, even though I'm afraid of elevators. He's reinforcing the symptom, and then he's doing this really pat, I deeply love and accept myself, which you can work up to a statement like that after dealing with the person's low self-esteem, but he's just laying it right on her. And then he gets worse. He starts having her tap in fear of elevators on these points on her body. And I'm watching, and I just think, okay, this is as stupid as I thought it was. But it'd be too embarrassing to leave right now. So I have to sit it out. So he finishes a round of tapping and does these ridiculous eye movements, and I'm just kind of really getting impatient. And but now she's gone from a 10 down to a 7, so that kind of is interesting. And I'm thinking, well, okay, there's a certain allegiance effect. She maybe doesn't want to embarrass him in front of his coworkers and his colleagues. And so then she does another round of tapping, and it goes down a little further. And I'm really starting to, it's this total cognitive dissonance. I mean, what is going on here? And then she does another round of tapping, and it goes back up to a 9. And I'm thinking, I knew it wouldn't work. It's just these little fluctuation things. But he didn't. What he did was he asked her what she was thinking when she rated it as a 9. And what happened was that a memory had come back from her childhood that she hadn't thought of in decades. And the memory was when she thinks she was about 8, and she was with her two brothers, and they were playing with a big carton, a big appliance carton, and with some of her brother's friends, and they would, one of them would get into it, and the others would push it along the lawn, and it was kind of a fun ride. But when it got to be her turn, they pushed it. There was only one side that was open, and they pushed it against a wall so that she couldn't get out. And because of her weight on the cardboard, she couldn't move it. So and then they leave. They're just kind of making fun of her, and like adios. And so there she is, and she is in the dark, and she can't get out, and she starts to scream, and she doesn't remember how long she screamed, but she is just completely terrified in this memory. By now, she's recovered the memory enough, and she's talking about that she's up to a 10. She's really activated, and and so I'm thinking, okay, something useful came out of this. Now the therapist will be able to work on this. The back home therapist will be able to work on this, and after a few months, it will start to get resolved, and then they can go back to the phobia, and it'll probably be easier to work with the phobia. But the TFT therapist didn't stop there. He starts to have her tap on this memory, and then he's having her tap on different aspects. I learned that that's the word of the memory, that her anger towards her brothers, her sense of betrayal, all the heart rate that is going to faster, so that now she is able to go back to the memory, and after all these different rounds, maybe 10 or 15 minutes worth of rounds, she is at a 0 with that memory. She's able to talk about the memory with no arousal. She still thinks it was a crappy thing they did to her, but she's not reliving it. Right. And so then, so I'm watching this with some amazement, because I mean, I knew how to work with those kinds of memories, but I'd never seen it go from a 10 to a 0 in 10 or 15 minutes. And so then they go back to elevators, and the elevator number goes down, really relatively quickly, maybe 3 rounds. And everybody's kind of a little bit where I am. I mean, they're a little, I think I was probably the most skeptical, but they were all surprised, how did this happen? And I was certainly surprised. And so, but psychologists need to test things. That's how we differ from other professions. We're really good at testing. And so there was a hall closet in this house, and right off the front door. And so somebody got the idea of having her step into the hall closet, since she was claustrophobic. And so the therapist, the TFT therapist, is real kind of, what do I say it, very sensitive. He really said, this is not to re-traumatize you in any way. The moment that you feel any kind of anxiety, just open that door and walk out. But she agrees to it, and she goes into this, and they close the door. And so we're kind of waiting. So imagine a dozen psychologists hovering around the closet door, waiting, and it's, it seemed like 5 minutes is a long time to wait. But my guess is we were waiting there for 5 minutes. Finally, the therapist knocks on the door and says, "Are you okay?" and opens it, and she comes out, and she's exuberant. She said, "I had no fear at all. It was just wonderful." So I'm sitting there thinking, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced in the last half hour, because it was talking. You asked about surprises. This was a big surprise. Yeah. Well, so I figured it out. What's happening here is that this is a social psychology experiment to see how gullible psychologists can be. So I was waiting for them to announce that, but nobody announced it. And it seemed like it was actually genuine. And so that was a big surprise. So based on that experience, I decided, okay, I got to learn this. So I, I ASAP had just had their first meeting, or maybe first or second meeting, and they had recorded all of the sessions. So, and Donna and I were on the road. We were on this road trip that we started in 2000 and still are on, basically. And and so we bought the recordings of the first or second ASAP. And
And so for the folks that don't know, what is ASAP? Just because not
oh,
everybody's going to know. Yeah.
ASAP is the professional organization for energy psychology in the United States. And
Yep.
ASAP stands for Association of Comprehensive Energy Psychology. And the reason that they call it comprehensive is because the founders noticed that there were people who were working with the meridians and the acupuncture points. There were people that were working with the chakras. There were people working with the aura. And they didn't want them to be competitive against each other.
Gotcha.
They wanted an umbrella organization. So I think that was very wise. And so they formed, but back in the early days, it was like energy psychology wasn't a known term. It was really just been coined and by Fred Gallo. And so what they did was they opened up, that anybody could apply to have a session, to give a breakout session in their conference. And so Don and I are listening to these breakout sessions, and it had attracted some really strange ideas. So in those early days, there were some breakout sessions that just were real turnoffs. But some of the sessions were really smart. I mean, they were really well articulated. And so that was when I decided, okay, I'm going to learn this. And one of the people that I really liked was named Lee Poulos, who's a hypnotherapist in Vancouver, I believe, in Canada, and he, maybe he's in Toronto, and he really articulated why he loves this tapping, that he combines it with hypnotic suggestion, and it makes it so much more effective. And so I call Lee and I say, I want to study with you. And he said, well, the courses I teach are for the general public, and what you need is courses that are for professional therapists. And Fred Gallo is doing a training on that. And so I call Fred and take the training. And so that was my second surprise. The first surprise was what I mentioned. The second surprise was that it worked for me. Because
I love that as a surprise. Like, even when we're engaging in things where we're going to learn to help people, it's like, oh yeah, I can actually use this too. I love that as a surprise in the process.
It is, and what I've learned is that that's how every new client feels, is that this isn't going to work for me. This is it's just unless they've really talked to people who have been helped. If they just think they're coming to a therapist and the therapist introduces it, it's just a little bit of a stretch to believe this is going to work. But then they're surprised. So that was my second surprise. My third surprise was that there was no research. In 2001, the first peer-reviewed clinical trial wasn't published until 2003. So I thought, well, okay, it's been going on for, Roger Callahan first started experimenting with this in 1980 about. And and I think his first book, The 5-Minute Phobia Cure, was about, I think 1985. And he was making all these claims and getting a lot of public attention. So why isn't there research? Because, therapists, like psychologists, depend on research, but it gone 15 years, there wasn't any research. So that was a surprise. Um, and then um, another surprise around research was that when I've done a number of review papers where I review the research that exists, and the surprise has been how fast the research has been coming in and how effective the method is proving to be. So from 2001 or 2003 really until 2022 right now, there are there's more than 125 clinical trials of some form of tapping, all of it being EFT or thought field therapy. Those are the two, the acupuncture forms that have really been researched, and that's partially because they have manuals that researchers can use.
And actually, I actually have a question about that before we continue on, because I think the word research is an interesting word for us to unpack. Over the course of the last couple of years, people are like, "Oh, I did my research," which oftentimes mean they've just gone and they've Googled something and they've gone to a source that already agrees with them, and they call that doing research so they can be a critical thinker. When we're talking about these clinical trials, what does that just basics, like as if you were talking to a sophomore biology class, like what is a clinical trial and how is it structured so that we can see it as a valid learning tool?
Sure. Yeah, because that's what science does, is it takes observations and it verifies that this observation can be generalized. And the way that it does it is that it measures some variable, such as anxiety. It measures it, then it does an intervention, and then it measures the variable again. That's what research is. And did the variable change as a result of that intervention? Did the anxiety decrease? And so that's a basic clinical trial. Now, in what's called a controlled clinical trial, you have two interventions and you compare them. Okay. So one intervention might be the tapping, and the other intervention may be having them read a book on that raises, an inspiring book. Did reading the book have the same effect as the tapping, or even no intervention at all, just the same time period? Maybe what happens is that there's some other factor that is making a difference. So you want to make sure that no intervention does not affect the variable. So that's a controlled clinical trial, and it's called a randomized controlled trial because the individuals being tested are randomly placed into one group or the other, so that's really comparing apples to apples. So the research that you're talking about, the kind of library research or now computer research, is an early step in research. You want to find out what other researchers have found, but to really conduct research, you need to do a pre-test, an intervention, and a post-test. And people can do that now. There's a book that just came out by Liz Boeth from Stratfordshire University on doing case studies, and that's an early form of research. It's kind of not. It doesn't have the status of a clinical trial because it's just one person, and there's many variables that can be influenced, but it's still very valid for clinicians, because it's also instructive for them to give, like if the person's complaint is anxiety, to give an anxiety measure, a standardized checklist, and then do the therapy and then see if it proved things on the checklist. And that's a very valid kind of research, and you can write up those studies so that they are published in different. There's some journals that just specialize in case studies, and many journals will take a good case study. So
Great.
that's
Thank
the
you very
range.
much. Yeah. So then now that as you've been like over the course of the last 2 decades, as the research has been coming out, what are the things as you've actually seen the research that is surprising in that particular experience for you as you've been diving in deeply?
What's really surprising is how well it works. It's effective for a wide range of disorders.
Yeah.
It's fast and it's durable. The follow-up studies show that 2 years later, the improved PTSD has stayed improved. So
And
that's
I'm glad, and again, I'm glad you're saying that, like, that it works is something that is surprising, because there are days where I will sit here in my office like this and I'll work with clients, and at 5:30 as I'm getting ready to get done, I'm like, really, is that just what happened today? Like, it's still like that sense of skepticism that you had when you were first introduced to it, that this is just so weird and it doesn't seem possible. As someone who, as it's personally transformed my life, and I've had the opportunity to work with thousands of clients from all over the world, there's still those exact moments for me where it's like, seriously? Like, we just thumped on our faces and this just happened.
I know I have that same. Oh my God, it worked again.
Yeah.
It just
Which I think is good. I think on some level that's good, because for things that work really, really well, I know in my own life, it can be easy for me to take them for granted and dismiss the power in them. And the fact that there are still these moments of delight and surprise with transformation makes it easier for me as an individual who taps on my own, and as a practitioner, to lean in more, because I can go, wow, wasn't that really, really cool? Boy, that was unexpected. And being able to celebrate that makes it easier to keep doing it, any sort of transformation.
Nicely put. So then another thing that was surprising was that research on the mechanisms was starting to show what happens in the brain. And I found that really, I don't know if surprising is the right word, but it really fed my curiosity. Because that's what every practitioner I know is, besides that experience of, oh my God, it worked again, there's also, how did that happen? What were the mechanisms that tapping and those words could overcome a lifelong phobia, like this woman's fear of closed spaces? And one thing I remember way back in probably 2004 or so, I ran into research that came out of Harvard Medical School, where they were looking at stimulating different acupuncture points. And they found that some points send a signal to the amygdala that deactivates the activity, that deactivates as the amygdala goes into a threat response, it deactivates it. So when we're tapping, we have gotten the person into the stress. We have them remembering the closed space, the woman remembering herself in that box. So her amygdala gets very highly activated. And then as she taps, it's like sending signals that deactivate it. And then the brain is having to reconcile this paradox that this is supposed to make me really upset, but I'm not feeling upset at all. And that's called a prediction error. And a prediction error is how mental models change, is through prediction. That is, the mental model did not correctly predict what. So that initiates a whole process of memory reconsolidation, and that so it's really interesting to just see what's happening there in the brain. And it's it's just fascinating to watch. And now more and more research is coming out as we're looking at what's happening with fMRI studies and other imaging studies. So it's a very exciting time to be working with this field.
And it's interesting. So as you describe it in this very mechanistic way of how things unfold, and what you're just describing, it makes perfect sense why when Gary Craig was starting to share this with the people in his community, he called it emotional freedom. Because there was this thing that was there and it got downregulated through this tapping thing. And so it felt like that we were liberated from it. And so, like, in a very artistic way of describing the exact same experience, was because that's what it feels like inside of the body. And so it's just interesting now that we're, again, as you mentioned, that we're starting to recognize the mechanism, that we went from going, oh, there is a mechanism here, we can do this, we put in input, we get this output, there's a mechanism, to now start to see the bits and pieces of it is exciting and encouraging, and makes it easier again for us to dive in, because as we see that. Have you been, as you've been going through the research and doing all this sort of work, have you had a place where you were surprised in a way that was disappointing, where you had a preconceived notion, or you're really hoping to discover something and the research actually showed the opposite of what the hypothesis was, or just personally what you were desiring?
Well, the biggest disappointment has been the field's lack of acceptance.
Yeah.
That has certainly been disappointing, and
Yeah.
I think it's starting to change.
Mm-hmm.
There are studies that I don't know how to interpret. There was just because most of the studies where they compare energy psychology with other therapies like cognitive behavior therapy, etc. Energy psychology holds up really well. Cognitive behavior therapy is the gold standard for conventional psychotherapy for PTSD, for depression, and for anxiety. It's the gold standard. And tapping seems to do at least as well, and possibly better. It's often the results last longer. It gets the results faster. So you have a really exciting, kind of, you're comparing yourself to the big boys, and you're winning. So that's been good to see. There's a study that just came out that had a totally different conclusion, that showed that just didn't show tapping EFT as beating the other therapies. And so I need to look into that more. But that's one surprising disappointment. And there can be all kinds of explanations. If the researchers had a bias against the energy psychology, that could shape the way the study was designed. But basically, I'd say that the research, the 126 or so studies that exist, are very encouraging, and that it may be that in our enthusiasm we're overestimating the power of it with certain kinds of conditions. So, like, for instance, for depression, there's a very strong effect size in working with depression, but the studies don't really distinguish between endogenous depression, which is really kind of lifelong and built in, and we don't really know whether tapping is effective with that. I know some therapists that think that it should be done in conjunction with medication. So there's a lot on that kind of more severe side that we don't know. We also don't know I mean, I don't think there's any research at all that shows that tapping is effective with overcoming certain conditions like, you know, dementia or, you know, probably, well, at least dementia and
Yeah.
psychosis. But I'll tell one last story. I I was speaking at an ASAP conference, and I was talking about bipolar disorder, you know, and I was saying that I was putting in that category of conditions that tapping doesn't treat effectively, of, you know, bipolar and dementia and psychosis. And a woman got really angry, and she raised her hand and she said that, oh wait, excuse me, I just gave the wrong diagnosis. It was dissociative identity disorder,
Hmm.
multiple personality that she
Yep.
was talking about. And she said that that the clinic where she works, that they use tapping, and it's very effective with DID. And she
Hmm.
said it used to take 5 years to help someone overcome it, and now it takes 2 years.
Hmm.
So that put it in perspective. But that was an interesting moment of getting
Yeah.
somebody really angry at me.
And the other thing I think is really kind of important to glance off inside of that is that on one level, it can be frustrating that it takes 2 years to deal with something. On another level, it's 40% of what's going on. I can remember years ago, I was working with a client who I think the only reason I was talking to her was to shut her partner up because her partner kept, oh, tap with Gene, tap with Gene, tap with Gene. And at the beginning of it, because she was not there necessarily by choice, she was very, very skeptical. And 15 minutes in, after a round of tapping, she was really super disappointed that a lifelong trauma didn't go away in the single round of tapping. And so she went from being super resistant to being super disappointed because it wasn't instantaneous. And I think it's really good for us to hear that just because it's faster than other things, it's easy for us to get our expectations even too high. And I love the fact that in the community, we've gotten further and further away from the conversations about 1 session miracles and 1 minute miracles, because I think they do a disservice to transformation. But being able to go have someone stand up and going, oh my gosh, it only took 2 years. And she was excited by the fact, and she was annoyed that you weren't recognizing that. I think it's good for all of us to hear when we're thinking about our own progress. If we're working with someone else or working on our own, that it's easy for us to have, happiness is outcome divided by expectation. And we can transform our expectations really quickly as we see this happening and get them out of whack. And so it's good to hear that like 2 years is exciting, because comparison, it's way better than what it could be.
Yes.
So anything else that just comes bubble into your head as you think about just the last 2 decades?
As you're telling that story, one of my favorite stories. Um, there's a wonderful physician in San Diego who delivered Donna's second child, Dondi, and he's kind of like the top gynecologist in the world. He's like 200 published papers, all that, but he got really interested in acupuncture.
Mm-hmm.
And he was telling all the other doctors to send patients that weren't responding, they didn't know what to do, and nobody would send anyone. He got 0 referrals. And then but he was working with it and learning acupuncture and really finding that it really supplemented his other skills. And so one Sunday, one of the doctors calls him because his horse woke up lame, and is a racehorse. And
Mm-hmm.
so this doctor was really concerned, and he didn't have any place else to go. The vet didn't have a good prognosis. And so Paul, his name is Paul Brenner, he goes to the to where the horse is, and he said, so the first thing I did was I just had to connect with the horse before I start sticking needles in him. So I just put my hand on his face and just looked eye to eye, and we connected. It was just a beautiful moment of love. And then I went about, did the acupuncture, and the next day the horse was fine. And so the next day is a Monday, so that's all that they're talking about in the doctor's lounge is how this had happened. And so Paul says, well, so it actually wasn't what you think. What happened was I made this loving connection with the horse that was so powerful. I think that's what healed his leg. And everybody else is saying, no, it was the acupuncture. And Paul said, that's when I knew I had them.
That's awesome. And there in technology right now, there is a lot of people sharing experiences that if you want help with a technology problem, you post the problem and then you log in under another account and you give a wrong answer. And people are unlikely to help you with the problem, but they're willing to correct a wrong answer. And so that was Jerry Kine, the old hypnotist, used to talk about DRTs, dirty rotten tricks, and that is a really good one. Saying, no, it was this, and getting them on the other side. That's awesome. Well, excellent. Well, David, I really, really appreciate giving us a little time today and sharing your experience. And even more so, I want to thank you for all of the amazing research, and even more so, like the summaries that you put together for those of us who do not have research backgrounds and are not scientists, have the opportunity to access this stuff in a way that's understandable. So it's easier for us to engage in our own lives, and it's easy for us to share it with our clients and our friends. So I just want you to know that I always appreciate whenever I get a note from you saying you've done another summary, because I know it's going to be a useful tool for me.
Thank you, Gene. It's really a pleasure to talk with you, and appreciate all that you're doing for the field. You're doing so much.
Awesome.